April 9, 1917, 5:20 a.m., north of Arras. Gunner Arthur Payne twists a mushroom-tipped device onto a high-explosive shell and checks the shear wire with a thumbnail. One turn, a click. He slaps the breech shut and the gun captain drops his hand. The gun barks. Payne watches the flash run along the trench line, feels the recoil, and waits for the echo that never comes. No dull thump buried in mud, no buried detonation. Up ahead on the German wire, there is only a clean white blink, and then nothing where the wire used to be. One sensitive part changed the blast. 1 millisecond changed the battle. The scene cuts wide. Northeastern France is a quilt of trench lines, belts of barbed wire, and shell-frothed fields. Miles of dugouts, tens of miles of wire in layered bands, 2, 3, sometimes 4 deep, each belt several yards thick and staked into the soil with iron pickets. The Western Front has been stuck for nearly 2 years. Not just stuck, systemically jammed. Artillery can tear up ground, infantry can seize yards, both together rarely move the line. The question that follows Payne's shell is the question that governed the entire front. Why did that flash on the wire matter more than the millions of blasts before it? By 1916, everyone understood the geometry of stalemate. High-explosive shells with delayed or ordinary impact fuses dove into wet chalk or Flanders clay before bursting, blowing craters that swallowed the next wave of shells. Shrapnel, once the king of the open field, sprayed balls across mud but glanced off wire, leaving twisted but unbroken belts. Infantry went forward into belts still intact, under machine gun arcs that had survived the preliminary bombardments in deep shelters. At the Somme on July 1, 1916, entire battalions stood up into this reality and were cut down in minutes. That day was remembered for casualties. Less told in numbers, but just as decisive, was the failure mode. Wire not cut, craters made worse, and defenders emerging from dugouts into perfect arcs of fire. The lesson was brutal, uncomplicated, and technical. If the wire stands, the attack fails. After the Somme, British ordnance engineers and artillery officers narrowed the problem. The wire had to be cut cleanly, predictably, and just in time. Just in time was not a slogan. It meant a specific behavior of metal and flame. The shell must detonate at the first kiss of wire or soil crust, on the surface, not underneath, so the explosive energy shears wire strands laterally instead of wasting itself underground. That behavior required a new kind of trigger, sensitive to graze, not merely to impact. Instantaneous, not delayed. Safe in flight, but eager, hair trigger eager, when it touched anything at all. The answer arrived in the last months of 1916 and spread through batteries in early 1917. A highly sensitive graze fuse with a shallow mushroom striker and a light shear wire that armed in the first 100 yards of flight. Its shape was distinctive, a flattened cap on the shell's nose, designed to touch wire first. When the cap struck so much as a taut strand, inertia drove a firing pin across the tiniest gap. The shear wire broke, and the detonator fired before the shell could bury. The result to the eye was subtle, a flat white blink and a puff of dirt blown sideways. To the wire, it was decisive. Strands severed, posts snapped, belts opened like curtains with cut cords. By April 1917 at Arras, that blink had become a technique. British planning stacked thousands of guns along a short front. Batteries rehearsed the change in firing tables required to lift a creeping barrage in short bounds, 50 yards at a move, every 2 minutes. Infantry companies were briefed to walk as if under a sliding roof of steel. The roof only worked if no one tripped at the eaves. The sensitive fuse made it possible. Instead of clawing trenches into a moonscape, guns could sit their bursts exactly on the wire, exactly on the parapet, exactly where a defender would raise his head and move the blast wall forward in a constant glide. It was not just the fuse, it was the combination. Less time spent pulverizing the front line, more time spent timing, less energy wasted in holes, more energy spent on horizontal cutting and keeping after the enemy's movement. If the burst is on the skin of the ground, an artillery officer explained to his men that spring, the shell does its work on what is above the ground. The numbers told a different story than 1916's massive week-long bombardments. Shorter bombardments, heavier opening minutes, a more even, methodical push by the guns, and fewer catastrophic breaks in the barrage line. The fuse turned artillery from a crude hammer into a moving door. At 0 hour on April 9, 1917, the door swung. Infantry on the Canadian front east of Vimy Ridge moved through gaps in wire that had been there for minutes, not days. The ground between the lines, once an obstacle course of craters, was flatter than in 1916 because shells had not been burying and belching mud. German teams emerged from dugouts into a flat wall of surface bursts that detonated on parapets and firing steps. Machine gun crews, who had learned to wait out barrages in deep shelters, found that the instant they touched the lip of the trench, there was a spark, then a burst on the lip. No time to set a sustained lane, no time to build the arcs. The creeping barrage, always a choreography problem, was no longer dancing on treacherous ground made worse by its own steps. By June, the pattern had matured. At Messines Ridge, the famous mines stole the headlines, but the day-to-day work of the guns relied on the same principle. Keep the wire down on the surface, keep the parapets broken, keep the defenders' eyes below the rim. The new Fuze traveled with the attacking units, packed in wooden boxes, fished out of tins by men like Payne, who had learned a new ritual. Check the cap, check the shear wire, seat it clean. The mushroom nose migrated from novelty to standard. At Passchendaele that autumn, mud undermined everything, but even in that swamp the logic held. A shell that bursts on the skin of the ground wastes less to the bog and gives the infantry, for a moment, a flat, brutal consistency. The deeper impact, however, was conceptual. Before the new Fuze, commanders thought in two boxes: preliminary destruction and infantry assault. After, they began to think in gradients: preparation, neutralization, masking movement, and synchronized advance under instantaneous bursts. Instead of annihilating a trench line outright, which drove survivors deeper, made the ground worse, and telegraphed the attack, artillery denied the defenders their windows. Bursts at wire level slit entrances, then stayed close enough to the lip to make machine gun mounting suicidal. Scattered German defenders still fought hard, and many attacks still failed for old reasons: mud, command friction, horses stuck on shell-torn roads, communications cut. But the wire ceased to be the fixed, binary gate it had been in 1915 and 1916. That shift showed in logistics. Factories did not just produce more shells, they produced a different distribution. High explosive with instantaneous fuses replaced part of the shrapnel allotment once used for wire. Forward dumps stocked more of the mushroom-capped noses and trained men to handle them gently. The cost was not trivial. Sensitive fuses demanded careful packing and policing of duds. The risk of premature detonation worried battery commanders. But on balance, the trade paid out in the coin that mattered. Minutes saved under fire, lanes opened when the schedule called for them, enemy machine guns forced down long enough for assault parties to cross. Look closer at a single-section attack. A platoon waits on a taped line, watches synchronized. The first lift of the barrage hits the forward wire at H-5. To the left, surface bursts cut a slot no wider than a barn door. The platoon sergeant can see the slot because the burst spalls wire sideways rather than throwing it into the sky. At H, the barrage moves 50 yards. The platoon goes in. Behind them, the battery has already dialed in the next band of wire, another 50 yards, on a prearranged timetable. If the fuse were delayed, those shells would dig in, roll soil, and leave ankle-twisting craters under the platoon's boots. Instead, the platoon crosses without losing formation. The difference is a technical choice made weeks before the attack, compounded by thousands of identical choices in dozens of batteries. Zoom out again. Tactical choices cascade into operational outcomes. If wire can be cut when scheduled, staffs reduce the length of preliminary barrages. Shorter preliminaries preserve surprise, cut the time for German counterbattery, and reduce the chance that trenches become an impassable morass before the assault. If the barrage stays on the surface, communications lines buried shallow are less likely to be severed by rolling explosions and dirt avalanches. Runners still die. Lines still break. But the percentage of messages that get through rises in the first minutes, the minutes when an assault lives or dies. Everything is a probability, and the sensitive fuse shifts several of them at once. Wire cut probability up, machine gun readiness probability down, infantry cohesion probability up, speed of exploitation up. By late 1917, the artillery vocabulary had absorbed the change. Staff tables spoke of neutralization instead of destruction. Infantry reported that wire in front of objectives was generally cut more often than standing. When it was not cut, the failure tended to be local, an angle missed, a fold in the ground sheltering a belt, rather than front wide. Units adapted tactics to ride the new capability. Bombing sections still trained for close-in cutting and trench clearing, but their main job shifted from hacking lanes under fire to exploiting the lanes already mapped. Tanks, introduced fitfully in 1916, found that in 1917 their cooperation with artillery under instantaneous surface bursts kept them from bogging in fresh craters, at least in the handful of dry windows that weather allowed. When Cambrai opened in November 1917, the combination of surprise, tanks, and a surface-bursting barrage cut through German wire on the first morning with a speed that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. What happened next made the pattern obvious. Wherever the barrage worked, as a moving ceiling, where guns could burst on contact and lift predictably, infantry closed with defenders still disoriented. Where the barrage tore the ground into pits, infantry staggered, crowded, and bunched. The same number of shells could produce two wildly different landscapes. The numbers told it in another way. When shells burst close to the surface, fragments traveled outward in a disk, shredding wire strands. When shells buried, fragments wasted themselves on wet earth. The fuse determined the geometry of fragments. The geometry of fragments determined whether a belt of wire remained a wall or became a gate. There were still limits. Weather always had a veto in Flanders. Sensitive fuses had their own failure modes. A thin crust of mud could trick a cap into detonating as intended, yet the energy still bogged. A too soft field blunted the effect. German defenses adapted too, adding more depth and moving machine gun posts back from the first belt of wire to secondary belts, forcing attackers to repeat the drill under fire. Counter-battery fire sought out the mushroom-nosed shells in forward dumps. And the human problem, coordination across brigades, divisions, corps, still stood. A brilliantly cut gate on one sector meant little if the neighboring division lagged, if the reserve cavalry could not move through, if the telephone lines cut at the critical hour. But the contrast with 1915 and early 1916 remained stark. Then, artillery made a desert, in the words of one staff officer, and the desert consumed the infantry as well as the defenders. Now, artillery made lanes. Lanes meant movement. Movement, even limited movement, meant the possibility of operational design beyond attrition. The new fuse did not end the war. It did not erase the mud or the machine gun. It did not neutralize German defense in depth, nor did it turn every creeping barrage into a smooth curtain. What it did was tighten tolerances, between fire and movement, between minutes and miles, between plan and execution. By tightening those tolerances at the contact point of metal and wire, it upgraded the entire choreography. The midpoint reveal is mechanical, not romantic. The mystery behind Payne's silent echo is simply this. In industrial warfare, control of when and where energy releases is everything. The sensitive fuse exported control from the laboratory to the battlefield, from a machinist's bench to a battery's ammunition limber, from a specification sheet to a trench line at dawn. Before, the shell chose its own burial, and the ground chose the blast shape. After, the guns chose the surface, and the blast shape served the infantry. 1 millisecond is the hinge. It reframes earlier scenes. The Somme week-long bombardment looks less like insufficient violence and more like the wrong geometry of violence. The 7-day drumfire sounded impressive and looked destructive, but it placed the blast in the wrong place at the wrong time. After the fuse's adoption, a 3-day or even a 1-day fire plan could outperform the longer, heavier efforts of 1916 because it directed the same chemical energy at the decision point, the wire and the parapet in the minute before the assault. Inversion matters. Less time, more effect. Less digging, more cutting. Fewer craters, more lanes. By the summer of 1918, Allied armies layered this principle with others. Counter-battery sound ranging, flash spotting, better maps, improved communications, air observation, and built an operational tempo the Germans could not match. The fuse itself saw iterative refinements, safer arming, variants that combined graze sensitivity with anti-ricochet features, and better waterproofing. The device remained small enough to sit in a man's palm and simple enough to be explained in a trench. Batteries carried them by the thousands. Each was a promise that the next shell would behave in a way a staff officer could plan around. In a war defined by friction, predictability is gold. Consider the economics. A single belt of wire might cost the defender a few hours' labor and a handful of pickets. Cutting that belt without the right fuse required either gross overmatch, thousands of shrapnel shells, or brutal human effort with wire cutters under machine gun lanes. With the fuse, a handful of high-explosive shells, timed and lifted correctly, did the job cleanly. Multiply that saving across a core front, across months, and the arithmetic changes. Fewer shells spent on the first belt means more tubes available to interdict reserves, disrupt counterattacks, and maintain the barrage schedule. The sensitive fuse is not just a wire cutter, it is a reallocation tool for firepower. Now the climax, brief, declarative, and direct. The fuse did not add more explosives to the battlefield. It added timing, it added certainty. It put the burst on the surface where the war was actually decided, in the wire, on the parapet, at the instant a defender's head cleared the lip. Thesis: a tiny change in detonation behavior turned artillery from groundbreaker to movement maker, and movement is what breaks stalemate. Resolution unfolds in consequences. Operationally, the new blasting geometry supported creeping barrages that infantry could trust, shortened fire plans that preserved surprise, and combined arms attacks, especially at Arras and Cambrai, that moved the line miles in a day instead of yards in a week. Culturally, it shifted how soldiers thought about artillery. Accounts from 1917 onward speak less about the bombardment as an indiscriminate storm and more about our barrage as a wall that moved with them. The word that recurs is cover, which, in trench warfare, is as much about timing as about walls. When men trust the wall to move predictably, they move. German defenders learned the new cadence. They added more depth to positions, laid secondary belts behind the first, and timed counterattacks to the barrage lifts. They improved their own fuses and set traps in wire lanes. The duel continued at higher resolution, yet even in adaptation, the basic shift held. With the right fuse, attackers could open the first gate with far less cost than before. What remained was the exploitation, the old cavalry problem in a motorless world, the logistics problem on roads that turned to soup in rain, the command problem across miles of wire and runner routes. The fuse solved the first hurdle. The rest still required hard learning. By war's end, artillery manuals wrote in matter-of-fact terms about instantaneous, graze-sensitive fuses as standard kit for cutting wire and for barrages meant to sit tight on forward positions. There was no romance to it, just a diagram of forces, a specification for sheer wire strength, a note about safe handling. The wonder, if there was any, lived with men like Arthur Payne, who threaded metal on metal in the dark, set caps under stress, and trusted that a chemist's delay measured in fractions of a blink would do exactly what everyone up and down the line had scheduled it to do. Return to April 9, 1917. Back to the gun pit, to Payne's thumbnail checking the wire, to the flat blink on the wire. On that morning, men walked through lanes that technology opened at the second they needed them. The assault still cost blood. The day still consumed lives. But the visible difference, wire falling in neat slots, defenders suppressed at the lip, ground that did not crumble underfoot, came from a device the size of a small egg. Not through heavier shells, but through smarter bursts. Not through more days of fire, but through more precise seconds. Not by making a bigger hammer, but by turning a hammer into a key. A man twists a cap, a battery fires on schedule, a line moves where once it froze. One sensitive fuse, a tiny change in timing, and the vast machine of trench warfare shifts a little, in the only direction that mattered.